Push Unfiltered, the best podcast to learn about A-Push content and all the American topics that you might need to learn about. I'm Jake.
And I'm Christos, and today we're going to talk about how organized crime didn't just affect politics, it affected whole economies and the economic structure of America. From underground alcohol rings to labor unions to white-collar fraud, the mob meant business.
Let's talk about an idea from Daniel Bell, who argued in his essay, Crime as an American Way of Life, that organized crime actually filled a role in America's growing capitalist economy. The mob gave poor immigrant communities a path to power, but in doing so, they also corrupted capitalism by exploiting its weaknesses.
And we saw that clearly during the Prohibition. I mean, the illegal alcohol trade wasn't just a black market, it was a full-scale economic system. Mob bosses like Al Capone made tons of money, probably millions of dollars in the 1920s, which is worth much more today. But it wasn't just about smuggling liquor. These networks were funded into legitimate businesses and unions, creating a mix of legal and illegal finances that just shouldn't work together.
This infiltration continued for decades. A recent study by economists Marco Limogli and Giuseppe Sorrenti shows how organized crime, especially groups like the Italian Mafia, use legitimate business as a front. These so-called entrepreneurs launch dirty money through restaurants, construction, and even real estate, hurting healthy competition and allowing criminal groups to control entire markets.
And one key way they did this was by gaining control over labor unions. The mob used pensions like piggy banks through people like Jimmy Hoffa, like we talked about in the last episode. And through him, the mafia accessed massive union funds to bankroll things like casinos and hotels. And they took money that was meant for workers and they used it for their own profit and power.
Yeah, it's just messed up. Like, I couldn't imagine going to work my 9 to 5 and my competitor is a mafia boss.
And he takes all of it.
Yeah. Frank Costello even admitted this during the famous 1951 Senate hearings led by Senator Estes Kefauver. When asked what his business was, Costello paused and said, "I make a good living." Pretty suspicious. The hearings showed the American public just how far the mob's influence went, reaching from back alleys to boardrooms.
And that influence, it's hard for the government to crack down. Even when they tried, the mob had layers and layers of money and muscle, but that started to change in the 70s with the introduction of RICO, like we talked about earlier. And this law made it possible to target the entire organization rather than just individuals, which made a huge difference. And let's talk about racketeering. It's not just mob slang; it's a serious federal crime and obviously illegal. Racketeering is when organized crime groups like the mob use illegal methods like extortion, bribery, or fraud to consistently make money through illegitimate businesses like speakeasies during the Prohibition era.
Mm-hmm. And we see RICO in action through cases like United States v. Salerno, as we mentioned last time with Fat Tony Salerno, a Genovese underboss who was convicted for racketeering, as Christos just mentioned. The Supreme Court later clarified how seriously the government could respond to economic crimes against organized crime. Salerno was sentenced to 100 years in prison and fined millions, showing that financial crime would no longer be ignored or tolerated by the government.
And the problem is that kind of infiltration distorts the real economy. Honest businessmen can't compete with mob-owned companies that don't pay taxes or play by the rules, and it kills competition and damages total economies in the long run. Real private, small-owned businesses were just being demolished by these big mob businesses.
Yeah, I mean, these mom-and-pop shops just couldn't keep up with large crime organizations. You just think about it logistically, it just couldn't happen. Yeah, and that's what made organized crime so dangerous to the economy. They didn't just run shady backroom deals. They bought restaurants, construction companies, trash collection services. On the surface, it looked legal. You just had your regular company doing everyday work, but underneath, it was all funded by racketeering, a very, very illegal economic crime. At the end of the day, racketeering isn't just about breaking laws, it's about creating entire fake economies that work in the shadows, layered on top of legal economies to look real. And when it happens, it's not just crime, it's control.
Yeah, and then came Abscam in the 1970s, which was an FBI sting operation that exposed just how easily organized crime could corrupt politicians as well. Undercover agents posed as Arab businessmen offering bribes, and they caught multiple members of Congress red-handed. And the operation showed that the mob didn't just expose and exploit the economy, but they influence the laws that shape the economy entirely.
Yeah, this almost became like a culture,
Yeah.
It was very common for politicians to take bribes so easily because that's the way the economy ran. All of this shows that organized crime wasn't just about the violence and the guns and the shootouts and the drugs. It was about money, power, and control. From bootlegging to bribing senators, the mob twisted the American economy for its own gain. But thanks to federal action in the late 1900s, especially tools like RICO and WITSEC, Witness Protection, that grip finally started to break.
So when we talk about organized crime in history, it's not just gangsters. We're talking about financial empires that were built on fear and corruption and the silence of the American people, and a government had to change its own rules just to fight back.
Yeah, I mean, listen, like you just look at this from a consumer standpoint, and it almost feels like you would feel taken advantage of by these mobs and almost scared of what they could do to your everyday economy. So that will wrap up this episode of A-Push Unfiltered. Thanks for joining us as we explored how organized crime shaped America's economy and forced it to evolve.
Make sure to tune in next time. We're going to break down the forces that shaped our history one episode at a time.